Hello, guys, and welcome back to another episode of the Cash Talk podcast. Today, I'm joined by the lovely Deline. Deline, I'm so excited to have you on. We're going to be chatting about all things financial planning for a family. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. I actually just got back from a long weekend away after end of financial year. I took the family, we went to Stanthorpe, which is about 2 hours and 45 minutes away from Brisbane, and we went glamping. So we stayed in a cabin. It was freezing. I think it got to like minus something degrees overnight because we came out, our car was like iced over, but the kids are really happy. We got to have a bonfire or like had a little fire pit happening, and we went to a snow festival there. So yes, it was really great. No reception, so it was really great to just like disconnect for a couple of days, but now ready to get into the new financial year with lots of changes happening.
Love that. Yeah, I love a little bit of a digital, just forced to kind of, put work away, put the phone away. Nah, that's really exciting. And yeah, it is exciting time, like new financial year, and I guess people looking into their financial goals. So I feel like it's really good timing for the podcast. But yeah, today we're going to be chatting about all the things to kind of consider if you're thinking about, say, starting a family, particularly from a financial aspect. But before we jump into that, I want to hear a bit about you. So maybe can you tell us, how did you get into financial planning? And yeah, what was your pathway?
Yeah, so like many financial advisors back in my day, I kind of fell into financial advice. It wasn't really like a profession that you like planned to go into like it is these days. And unlike an accountant or a lawyer or doctor. So back when I was at uni, which was 16 years ago now, I went and studied business, and I was starting to do event management there. So I think they call that like a Mickey Mouse degree. But then I realized in the first semester that wasn't for me because I didn't want to be working weekends and public holidays for the rest of my life. So I switched into finance because I had gotten a high distinction for business stats. And then I thought, I must be good with numbers. So I switched into finance. So the degree I did was more probably relevant for somebody who was going to be a fund manager rather than a financial planner. There wasn't a financial planning degree at my uni back then. But then when I was coming towards the end of my degree, I started working for a financial advisor and really fell in love with it. So basically just continued down that path. I stayed with that advisor for about a year and then moved to Brisbane. So I was on the Gold Coast at that point, moved to Brisbane, and I worked for Sun Super back then. It's now called Australian Retirement Trust, but I worked for Sun Super for about 3.5 years, and I did a few different roles there. I worked in the call center giving general advice, which was great for my developing my audio and interpersonal skills, giving that phone advice, I guess. And then I moved into the financial advice department and also did a stint in insurance claims as well. So I did a few different roles. But then I decided if I want to be a financial advisor, I need to go work for a financial advisor. So I reached out to a few advisors that I really wanted to work with, and I worked at Aspire Retire. So I worked there for 4.5 years, and in that firm, it was self-licensed. It was a boutique style firm, probably about 12 employees, including the directors. And we mainly focused on high net wealth type of clients. So a lot of self-funded retirees and business executives. And so a lot of SMSF advice, trusts, all that kind of fun stuff. And then I had my first child while I was there and finished my CFP, my Certified Financial Planning certification. But then when I was looking to have my second child, I really wanted to take a side step just to kind of think about what my future would look like. So I took a role with an industry fund again, so NGS Super. They had just merged with QIEC, and they didn't have an advice department in Queensland. So I took that role to kind of get that off the ground and was giving holistic advice through the fund. But then after a couple of years there, I decided now was the time to rip the Band-Aid off and start my own business. So that was about 18 months ago now. And it's going well.
It's crazy that it's 18 months ago because I feel like that time has gone so quickly, but it's super exciting to see you like having your own business. And I'm interested to hear a bit about how that's evolved and how you really do it all, I guess. Like you mentioned before, you were doing your CFP when you were like having a baby. And I'm just like, I feel like there's a whole story around that. But how do you juggle, family, work, kids, business? How are you finding it all?
Oh gosh, I don't even know, to be honest. There've been different points in time where I've had different help. So at one point we had an au pair to help us with the childcare responsibilities. So having 2 children in childcare is quite expensive. And that was back when there was an annual cap of $10,000 worth of subsidy a year. So we had an au pair for about 15 months who lived with us, and that was amazing. At other points in time, I've had like a regular cleaner. So I try to outsource some responsibilities. Right now, my husband is working part-time so that I can ramp up the business. I did work part-time for a period of time as well when my in the first like when my son was my firstborn, I went back to work part-time to start with and only went back to full-time when he was 18 months. So I went back to work when he was 5 months part-time and then slowly built that up. And then with my daughter, I just realized the second time round that working part-time doesn't really work in our industry. And so I just decided to go back full-time when she was 8 or 9 months. But then I had the au pair, so that helped. So I don't know how I've done it all. I've just set goals and make it happen. I don't know, probably don't get enough sleep, to be honest.
I know, something we all need more of, but yeah, it is true about the part-time. I guess even advisors later in their career looking to sort of retire, it's a really difficult job to do part-time because there's so much to keep up with and legislation changes and of course looking after clients. So no, very exciting. And I will link Mazi Wealth, your business, below for any listeners who want to reach out to you. But let's jump into financial planning for a family. Now, I feel like when you're starting a family, there can be so many different moving parts in terms of, income changes. We've got parental leave, childcare costs. There's so many things like changes that are happening all on top of the whole new adjustment of now having a child that maybe you've never had before, and it's a whole new learning curve. So I'm interested to touch on like, what do people need to consider and how do they get started in terms of that financial process, which might feel a little bit overwhelming if they are looking to start a family?
Yeah, there's so much involved. So I guess it comes down to, first of all, the start of the process, like when you're trying to conceive, having a plan in place if you're not able to conceive naturally. I think that's really important because you need to kind of think about, well, if you do need to go down the assisted fertility treatment route, like is it through IVF, how much is that going to cost? So it's around having a bit of a nest egg behind you to be able to fund that process. And then also thinking about when you do fall pregnant, are you going to go through the private or public system? Because there's pros and cons to both. I actually had one of each. So I had a public hospital experience the first time and then a private the second. And they were both great experiences in some ways, and then in other ways there was, disadvantages. So it's around thinking about how you'll fund that. But with all of those sorts of things, the biggest thing to think about is your cash flow, because that is the foundation for any sort of financial planning, any sort of life planning. It really comes down to understanding what's coming in and how much you can save to fund those initial expenses, how much time you're going to take off work, what paid parental leave your work offers, are you eligible for the government paid parental leave? So there's so much to consider. Like, what do you have to add on that, Nicola? Because I don't even know where to start. There's so much involved.
Yeah, I feel like, two different trains of thought. One that I was kind of interested in elaborating on, as you talked about, like assisted sort of fertility treatments, and, IVF can be very expensive and it's sort of in those thousands of dollars realm. And the other thing that I was listening to a podcast on this, interestingly, the other day, that more and more people are thinking about, things like freezing their eggs as they're thinking of starting a family later on in life. That can also be quite expensive, definitely in the thousands of dollars. So kind of making a plan for that, if that is something that you're considering. But yeah, I think the biggest one is probably the reduced income. And I guess this is so personal because some people might take just the amount of paid parental leave that they get from their employer or through the government as well, but that might not match their previous income. Whereas other people might want to take, you know, a few years off to raise the child, or maybe they're plan on having kids quite close together. So it could be, you know, multiple years with a single income. So then it's like, okay, how do they start planning for that reduced income? Because that could be a bit of a shock to the system when you're sort of used to having, you know, 2 incomes, no kids, lots of discretionary cash going around. So yeah, making those changes. And yeah, I guess it is something you need to think about early in terms of parental leave, because I know different companies have different policies in terms of even if you've had like 1 child, sometimes you have to wait like another couple of years before you can get paid parental leave again. So yeah, the budgeting side of things is really interesting to chat about, but like, where can people start in terms of preparing for that potential income drop?
Yeah, I always try and encourage people to practice before they have their child. So it's the same with people leading into retirement. I might say, let's practice living on that lower income for the couple of years leading up to it, so it's not such a shock to the system. So it's the same when you're going to have children. Obviously, you can't plan for every expense when you've got a child, because you don't know if your baby's going to have like additional medical needs, or, you know, you don't know if you're going to end up having to formula feed and that's going to cost money or whatever it is. But I think if you can try practicing in advance, and everyone's situation is going to look different because it's going to depend on what your expenses are. So the first thing to do is really sit down, write down all your expenses, like your mortgage, your food, you know, all your bills. Give yourself money for spending money, like your Kmart budget, because parents need that. So sit down and write everything down, and then looking at, well, what income is coming in. If we've got one parent that is going to be on reduced income or no income, like, can you survive on that one salary? If not, then you need to work out, well, what's the gap going to be in terms of how long you want to have off work, and you need to really aim to have that money set aside so you can drip feed that into your everyday spending to give you the required cash flow you need. So some people can live on one salary when they're disciplined. Other families will need to save up a sizable buffer. So that's the starting point. It's just sitting down and working out what all the outgoings are going to be, or what you know of, and then what's the incomings. And if there's a gap, then we need to save up a buffer to fund that gap. And that gap's going to be different for everybody depending on how long you want to have off work. Just like you said, Nicola, like, is it just taking paid parental leave and then going back to work because you can't afford to go much longer than that, or you don't want to go longer than that? Or are you looking to take off, 5 years till your kids start school? Like, it's going to differ for everybody.
Yeah, and I think it really helps kind of sitting down and looking through it, because it does help you make those trade-offs in terms of what's actually more important to me. Would I rather go back to work earlier and like have more money flowing around and more maybe holidays or things like that, or do I actually value having just that time at home, but like maybe there are other things I have to give up, and that's fine, but it's just going to be different for each person. But yes, definitely something I really like that you mentioned practicing it beforehand, because I think, yeah, it's definitely good to like get the finances sorted so that when the child does come along, that's the one thing that you're not sort of like just on the back foot about. So,
and then not being surprised, like, oh, no, like, we can't actually afford to live on one income. I have to go back to work quite soon. So it's not being surprised, it's actually understanding upfront. And I also think it's really important to acknowledge that you're not, if it's your first child, like, you're not going to know how you feel when baby comes along. Like, are you loving it and wanting to stay home, or are you one of those people that just want to get back to work because it's actually easier being in the paid workforce than it is doing the unpaid domestic duties and child rearing duties, in my opinion. So just, I think, allowing a buffer so that you can plan for either option if you think you're going to go back quickly, just allow some extra time, because you might find that, like I said, baby might have medical concerns, you might have medical concerns, you might just love being at home full time. So just have some options available, I guess, if you can.
Yeah, 100%. So you've kind of got that like choice, and you're not forced. Yeah, super important. Maybe let's also chat about, I guess, the next stage of life where they're maybe ready to go. You are ready to go back to work. There's going to be childcare costs coming in. Childcare can be very expensive. And so let's chat a little bit about, there has been recent changes to the childcare subsidies and what this means for families.
Yeah, so there's been lots of changes in the last few years. Like I mentioned earlier, back when I started putting my kids into childcare, there was like an annual cap on how much subsidy you could get. That cap has now been removed. And then since that time, there's also been a higher subsidy for multiple children if you've got children under 6 years old. So what that means is your second child could potentially get a higher subsidy. And then the new changes in July is that there was an increased subsidy and an increased income threshold. So what I mean by all of that is, with like many social security benefits, there's usually some sort of means testing. So either an asset test or income test. With the childcare subsidy, this one is just income tested. So your family income needs to be below a certain threshold in order to get some subsidy. And it's a tiered system. So depending on how much you earn, you'll get less subsidy the more you earn. So previously, before 1 July, it was around 350,000 as a rough figure that you could earn as a family before you got cut off any childcare subsidy. So that's both parents if you're part of a couple. Moving forward, it's going up to 530,000 as a couple. So that means people between 350 to 530 can now actually get some subsidy. And the amount that you can receive is a higher percentage. But I do also want to say that a lot of childcare subsidies have increased. A lot of childcare centres have increased their fees for the new financial year. So people thought they were going to be saving a lot more with the new subsidy, but unfortunately, that's been eroded with the new fees that have come out, which is understandable in some ways with inflation, minimum wage going up for childcare workers. I prefer to use early childhood educators, but just trying to keep it simple for this podcast. So yeah, there are a few changes happening, and as I mentioned, the amount you can receive has gone up. So it used to be different percentages. It's going up to is it 90? Oh, hang on, let me double check. Are you going to edit this, by the way?
Yeah, it has gone up to 90. The top one, and then the tiered system goes down. As your income goes up, the percentage you receive will be less. So it's interesting that you did touch on the childcare increasing the cost though, because that's actually not something I was super aware of. And it does make sense, but I think that's important for listeners to know, because you don't want to kind of like work off particular numbers and think that you're going to have X amount of savings when it might actually be a bit less than that. So definitely important to look into in terms of.
So like for my centre, my daughter who's still in early childhood education, hers is only going up 6%. So it's not much compared to what I'm hearing other people's fees going up to. But my son's after school care, so OSH, out of school hours care, his is going up 24%. So it's a huge increase. And so he's turning 6 in a couple of months, which means we'll lose that second, like the extra subsidy we get for the younger child. So I'm going to be sitting down in the next week, hopefully, if I get the time, and re-looking at the budget, re-looking at the numbers. And July is a really good time to do that, regardless of whether you're starting a family or you've got a family already. So January, or leading up to January and July, I think are the really key points to sit down and just revisit those numbers.
Yeah, definitely. And it is really good that over time they have increased childcare subsidy, because I think there have been periods of time where it hasn't really been financially incentivizing. I guess predominantly women is primarily the stay-at-home parent statistically, and there hasn't been that financial incentive to go back to work, and like what that does mean for women's careers long term, because obviously more time out of the workforce and skills and whatnot, and just how that impacts like their career trajectory. So it is really good that it is more at a level now where it does make more financial sense to have both parents working.
Yeah, because I think back when the subsidy capped out at $10,000, like that kind of was about 3 days a week. So if you wanted to work 4 days or 5 days, I was literally working for like $7 an hour, because once you took out childcare subsidy, and I know childcare is a shared expense, but it was at that point in time, it was a decision on, like, I was able to work part-time and willing to, whereas my husband wasn't able to in that point in his career for various reasons. So it did come down to like, what the difference was on my salary if I was to go up to that 4th or 5th day. But I chose to do it in the end because there were other benefits, such as, like you said, the career progression. So if you are working part-time, you're less likely to be promoted, or less likely to have the, the time to be promoted if you're managing teams and things like that. There's also other benefits like superannuation that you could be missing out on if you're working part-time. So definitely removing that cap was a great move, so that more parents felt like they could increase their paid work and contribute to the economy essentially. At these days, with the way property prices and mortgage prices are, it's kind of hard to live on one salary. So that's also a factor in today's climate, I guess.
And it does, I guess, even from like a tax perspective, make more sense to have 2 incomes, because you could have the same amount of dollars coming into the household just from one income earner. But because of the way like our tax system is, all of those dollars would be taxed at the highest marginal tax rate versus having 2 incomes where you're both getting the benefits of the lower income brackets. So your overall like household tax position is lower. So lots of different things to consider. In terms of, I guess we've touched on like the direct costs of like having a family, but what are like, I guess, things that you work on with your clients in terms of the bigger picture planning, things like what to do about super, insurances, paying down debt, investing, all those fun things.
So much. So I guess leading up to having a family, if you haven't done it already, even if you've got a family, if you haven't got like insurances and estate planning sorted, they are really key. I always recommend, if you're going to have planning to have a family, to try and do those sooner than later, because I promise you, once you start having a family, you just do not have the time or the energy or the mental capacity to do those things. So if you can look after them before you start having children. So estate planning, that's around, having a will. So in the will, you can nominate who you want to be your guardians of your children. It's not legally binding, but it does set out your intention. And those guardians can then, put their name forward and apply to the court to get that legally binding then. Then it's also things like power of attorney or power of guardianships, depending on what state you're in. There's different documents depending on the state. That's even more important, because that's the one, if you can't make decisions for yourself because you've lost capacity or you've had some sort of accident, then you've got a plan in place on who can step in and make some financial decisions or make some personal or health decisions on your behalf. So that's really important, because you need to think about if you are part of a couple and something happens to both of you, then who's going to step in, especially if you do have young children. So those things. And then your superannuation doesn't automatically form part of your will, and a lot of people do have insurance inside their super, so that becomes quite a sizable asset in the event you pass away. So you really need to have a nomination in place that's in line with the rest of the estate plan. So yeah, estate planning is really key. And then the insurance is, as I've kind of alluded to already, if something happens to you, whether you pass away, you become permanently disabled or temporarily or partially disabled or suffer some sort of critical illness, it's really important to have those covers in place so that you're not financially stressed while you're going through recovery or rehabilitation, or, you know, if you do need to unfortunately leave your children with somebody else, that they're not going to be financially burdened if they have to take over guardianship of your kids. So insurances are important, and I do encourage to get those done before you start having kids, because there could be things like, you know, postnatal depression, or there could be something that goes on with your birth or your labor that can cause you to claim. And I've seen that in the past with clients and friends. And as we get older, it does become harder to get insurances with like no exclusions or loadings. So if you can get them done before all those things kick in, it does make it easier, and you've got more comprehensive cover. So yeah, there are a few like foundational pieces, insurances and estate planning. Is there anything you want to pull out of that before we move on to the next the next part?
No, I really like that you touched on the insurances, and I think it's super important from like a peace of mind perspective in terms of, you know, knowing your family's protected, and that if something was to happen, like money would be the last thing you'd have to worry about. And also, yeah, the estate planning one's really interesting, because I think a lot of people, when they're kind of in that accumulation phase of maybe they haven't got a huge asset position at the moment and they've got a mortgage and whatnot, you kind of think, oh, estate planning, like I'll worry about that later, like it doesn't matter too much. But when you actually take into account the insurances and the fact that if you were to claim on insurance, the asset pool then would be so much bigger.
Yeah.
I feel like that's barely ever talked about and is super important to consider, because yeah, it all works together. And yeah, just getting those things that you can get sorted early on is ideal.
Yeah, definitely. And then yeah, you mentioned other things like debt versus investing. So yeah, it really comes down to like the cash flow. So what sort of surplus we have as to what our choices are. So when we and it comes down to the education cost, whether it's an early childhood education or are we doing private schools or public schools, like it all comes down to like, what is the cash flow? What's the surplus? And then what do we do with that surplus? Do we pay down debt? Do we invest some way for some more medium or shorter term goals? Do we put it into superannuation for our longer term needs? So it really comes down to like your goals and objectives and your personal circumstances, but these are all things that we definitely need to like balance out and have those trade-off discussions on to work out what's going to be right for the individual's circumstances.
100%. And I think that like we always kind of have the things of like, oh, but if I can invest, like I'll be able to do this, or like almost like that magic pill sort of thing. But I also feel like one of the biggest things that we do is help people consider those trade-offs of like, you know, maybe holidays versus private schooling versus debt versus investing, like, and there's so many factors, and like there's no one size fits all, because it depends on your goals and your income and your tax rate and so many different things. And it is hard to know because there's so many different opinions out there and articles out there, and it's just like, how do you keep up with it all? And I think having a plan in place and not knowing that you can kind of not stress about it is ideal. One other one that I want to touch on is, and I guess this can sometimes tie into investing or planning ahead of time in terms of the cost of this, but private school fees. And I know that they can be really big, and in Australia, I think I've read some numbers around it that quite a high proportion of them are actually paid by grandparents. Now, not everyone's going to have grandparents that are going to pay for private school fees, but if that is something you want, I guess the first question is, how do you make that trade-off between maybe private schooling versus buying in a really good area and going public schooling, and then also like funding private schooling if you do decide that that's what you want to do?
Yeah, there's no right way of going about it. They are just
Mm.
different considerations, because, you know, buying into and selling property is not that cheap. The transaction costs are huge. So
Mhm.
it's not as simple as just saying, well, we'll just buy into a better area, because can you afford it? And especially if we include some stress testing on that, what would be generally a higher mortgage, if it's a high demand catchment area, can we afford if rates continue to go up? So as financial advisors, we usually add in a few % on top for stress testing, just to make sure if rates go up, we can still afford that. But then also understanding, well, what's the stamp duty or the purchase costs to get in? And then if you're selling your other property, if you've already got one, what's that going to cost in terms of agent commission? So it's not really a straightforward answer. And I often find, like in Brisbane, there is some really high demand catchment areas, and there's very low supply as well.
Mm.
So you can be waiting around for a while to find a house that's going to be suitable, or you could be having that trade-off around, well, I'm going to be in the catchment, but it's going to be the actual house or apartment is definitely not going to be as spacious as what you might get in more of a different suburb. So there's lots of considerations. What I will say though is I have seen plenty of clients in the past where they've come to me at the other end of the journey, where their kids are now graduating school, they're becoming empty nesters, and they're now got surplus income because they're not paying private school fees anymore. And I just look at them and I can see they have been stressed, they have been tired, and it's because they've put, 3 kids through private schooling where they really couldn't have afforded to do that. It was a value of theirs though, so they've obviously made that sacrifice. But what I want to say is, if you're having those discussions with yourself or with your partner and thinking about this, I think it's really important to have a financially secure household. That is more important. So you might hear the term, like the saying, fit your own oxygen mask before you fit your child's oxygen mask on a plane. It's the same with your finances. Like, you need to make sure that you're not going to be financially stressed, because that's going to impact your kids, and it's going to reflect on them. And I'm not trying to, can't think of the word right now, but you know what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I completely agree about the oxygen mask. And yeah, it is one of those things where, again, it's a trade-off discussion of maybe that is your value, but do you then have to go and work a really stressful job where you never see the kids, and then that impacts, relationships and just your lifestyle in general and your health, and there's so many things to consider. It's yes, it may seem like that's worth it, but how worth it is it, and what are you willing to give up for that? And I think it's something to really think hard about, and really put time into that decision, because especially it can be hard to undo, in the sense that once your child does start at that school, there's sort of that pressure that they want to finish their education there, and then maybe you've got 3 kids and they're 3 years apart each. That's a 12-year for their high school schooling costs, a 12-year financial commitment to pay those fees. So it's not something that should be taken lightly. And I think that considering those trade-offs in your lifestyle in general is also super important.
I totally agree. Yeah. And even the house, yes, I could go live in a nicer house. I've just got a modest house, but I also don't want to have the bigger mortgage, because I don't want to be forced, and I know I'm in a privileged position to say all this, but I don't want to be in a position where I'm working around the clock all the time. Yes, I've done that at end of financial year, but that's a different story. But I want to be able to spend time with my kids and not have to work 2 jobs essentially. And both my husband and I have flexibility to work part-time so that we can be around for the kids. So, go to their schooling events, their sports events, all those kind of things. So it is definitely a trade-off. Yes, could have a nicer house that doesn't need as much maintenance, that looks nicer, but then also that means I've got less, I'm really tied to my work and my job, and less time for my kids essentially.
And I think, and then it sort of feels like you don't have what a lot of humans kind of desire is like choices and freedom. It feels like it's very much like what comes in goes out, and it like can be very stressful. And I think that, yeah, when we are committing to a mortgage, that is a 30-year commitment. So if we are overstretching, like it can put a lot of strain on, you know, the family life and relationships, because we know that finances play such a big part in that. And so I'm really glad you brought that up, because I also agree with you. I think it's really important to make sure that we still have that cash flow to like be able to have freedom and like go on holidays and enjoy our money too, and not be chewed up by paying off a nice home. So yeah, that's really important. And I know you touched a little bit on the parents and like, I guess, getting to that point of like empty nest. Maybe the kids are finishing uni or starting uni and they're maybe moving out of home, and then maybe have got more surplus cash flow than they did in the past. So that's quite a good time to maybe also make some tweaks to your plan. How should people go about that, or what's some things to consider at that point?
Typically what I see with clients at that point is they usually have a year off after the kids have finished school and kind of go a bit crazy, which because they've been like really you know, like tight with their cash flow for many years. So I typically find what happens is they have a year off, get it all out of their system, and then they come to me a year later and they say, okay, our kids have finished school, we've had a year off, we've had some breathing space, but now we want to get serious because we need to start planning for our retirement again, or like, you know, boosting our retirement, potentially bringing it forward, whatever it is. So at that point, the strategies are obviously very different. So it's around, you know, if we're not already maximizing our super contributions, we might be doing that. Really focus on making sure that we are going to be debt free in retirement. So clearing that mortgage and smashing that down as much as possible. So the strategies are typically a bit different at that point. So I think it's important to note that, like, you know, in those younger years when you've got the kids, it's often trade-offs around, like putting food on the table versus like putting money into super. Like if that's a discussion, that's going to be a very different outcome compared to when you're in your 50s or whatever it is, when your kids are 50s, 60s, whatever it is, your kids have left home and now you're focusing on you again, about making sure that you're still enjoying your life, not living very lean, because those years you've still got pretty good health usually, and you need to make sure you're enjoying life and not just waiting till retirement before you start traveling and start doing the things you want to do, because you just don't know where your health is going to go at that point.
Yeah, 100%. And it also kind of is good to, like you said before, practice or like ease into the lifestyle a bit, because I think even retirement itself can be such a huge transition when you go from, perhaps having full-time work and the kids in a very like busy household and maybe like after school and all of these kinds of things to, you know, then just having work and then like moving into retirement. That's like a whole new transition and a whole new lifestyle. And I think that can be hard for some people as well. So kind of practicing that beforehand is
I definitely see a lot of synergies though between families starting, like dropping income to be able to have children, and then when they get to retirement, dropping income to retire. Like there's a lot of emotional, like the same sort of emotions that come with it. So while I haven't retired yet, I can appreciate some of the comments like those retiree clients feel, because I've had that experience at the start with like kids and dropping income for a while. And so I can kind of appreciate that it's always just a transition period that you've got to get used to, that what's a new normal. So just being kind on yourself as well. Like it does take a while to get used to a new, new way of living and a new cash flow system. And so it's just takes a bit of time. It's not something that happens after a couple of weeks and you're used to it.
Yeah, particularly because it's like such a huge mindset shifts when you're going from like you're always having cash flow coming in and like saving and accumulating versus now like drawing down on those assets. I can imagine it feels very scary at that point, because like I said, I also haven't retired, but it's a huge mindset shift that I'm sure people do struggle with. So I think having that person
Yeah.
there to like reassure and help you like work through those transitions.
Yeah. I know we have to finish up soon.
Yeah.
I do want to just touch on one thing that you kind of raised already around grandparents, like paying for private schooling. That's, I think, really a really interesting thing, because you might have heard of like the sandwich generation, because yes, you might be getting older, empty nesters, but then often what happens at that point in life is you might have your own parents who start requiring assistance. So whether it's additional help in the home, or starting to think about aged care for elder parents. I spoke to a prospect, a client lead recently, and they've got like 4 generations living in the one household, because they've got elder parents themselves, and then they've got their children with their grandchildren, and that's because of the trying to get into the property market in like some of these more expensive capital cities like Sydney and Melbourne.
Yeah.
So it's not as simple as saying, oh, well, the kids have like finished school and now we've got all this surplus income. Like everyone's circumstances are so different. So there is often, again, coming back to what I've said before about fitting your own oxygen mask. So for this prospect client, we did talk about, yes, you want to help your children and your grandchildren, but you need to make sure that you are able to actually retire, because you're getting older as well. So it's definitely a balancing act between looking after them, but then also looking after yourselves.
Yeah. And I think that also, I see that quite commonly, like people want to help their kids or grandkids, but I think it's also important to remember that they are going to learn from what you don't necessarily just give them, but what you show them too. So I think that, maybe you're not passing on like money to them necessarily, but as if you're kind of like raising their awareness and like education and that kind of thing, like I think the last thing you want is to, put yourself in a kind of detrimental financial position to give money to them. It's like really important to consider what they're going to absorb from that, not necessarily from a financial perspective too.
Totally.
But thank you so much for coming on the show. We've talked through so much. For anyone who wants to maybe reach out to you or learn more about what you do, where can our listeners find you?
My main social media is Instagram, which is my business name, Mazi Wealth, or LinkedIn under my name, Deline Jacovides. Otherwise I've got my website. But yeah, I operate pretty similarly to AFA Group in terms of the types of clients we look after. So we've got, I think, similar philosophies in terms of the financial advice. So yeah, that's how they can find me.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for coming on the show. And for everyone who's listening, thank you for tuning in.
Bye.